Let me help you create an engaging, real-life narrative that's both compelling and appropriate for YouTube. I'll focus on part 1 of the story while keeping it authentic and human-centric. David Richardson never imagined that his family's 3-acre property, passed down through 3 generations, would become the center of a devastating legal battle that would change his life forever. The modest house, with its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden, had been his grandmother's pride and joy since 1963. She had purchased it when few other black families could buy property in the developing suburban neighborhood of Pine Grove. In early 2023, David was tending to his seasonal vegetable garden, just as his grandmother had taught him, when he noticed an official-looking envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a letter from the Pine Grove Homeowners Association, claiming that his property was in violation of several recently updated community guidelines. The violations cited seemed peculiar: the height of his heritage oak trees, the traditional style of his fence, and even the placement of his vegetable garden, which had existed long before the HOA was established. At first, David dismissed it as a simple misunderstanding. After all, his property predated the HOA's formation by decades. He wrote a polite response explaining this fact, including copies of the original property deed and historical documentation. But the HOA's replies became increasingly aggressive, with mounting fines and threats of legal action. What David didn't know then was that his property had become a target in a calculated plan. The surrounding area had been experiencing rapid development, with luxury condominiums sprouting up on every available plot. His 3 acres of prime real estate had caught the attention of developers who had quietly gained influence within the HOA board. The situation escalated and David received notice of a $50,000 fine for accumulated violations. His neighbors, many of whom had known his family for years, began whispering about strange meetings and questionable changes in HOA leadership. One evening, his elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen came to his door, visibly worried. She had overheard conversations at an HOA meeting that suggested something far more sinister than simple property violations. "They're trying to force you out," she said, her hands trembling as she handed him a cup of tea. "They've done this before in other neighborhoods. They find ways to make life impossible for homeowners who won't sell." David began documenting everything, every letter, every interaction, every seemingly minor incident. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside his house at odd hours, taking photos. Anonymous complaints about his property started appearing on community message boards. Even his mail began arriving damaged or delayed. The strain began to show. David, who worked as a high school science teacher, found himself losing sleep. Constantly worried about losing his family's legacy. His students noticed his distraction, and his colleagues suggested he seek legal help. But finding a lawyer willing to take on the powerful HOA seemed impossible, until he met attorney Grace Washington at a community legal aid clinic. Grace listened to his story with growing concern, poring over the documentation he had gathered. "What they're doing isn't just unethical," she explained, spreading the papers across her desk. "There's a pattern here that suggests discriminatory practices. Your property's historical significance makes this even more serious." As Part 1 draws to a close, David and Grace begin to uncover a web of corruption that extends far beyond simple property disputes. The true scope of what they're facing becomes clear when they discover that similar cases have been happening across the state, all following the same pattern, but none of the victims had fought back quite like David was prepared to do. Looking at his grandmother's old photos on the wall, David made a promise to himself. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about standing up to a system that thought it could bully and discriminate without consequences. With Grace by his side and the truth as their weapon, they were about to embark on a fight that would expose decades of systematic discrimination and change their community forever. The investigation into Pine Grove's HOA practices took an unexpected turn when Grace discovered a pattern of similar cases throughout the county. Over coffee at her small law office, she spread out documents showing how other historic properties had been systematically targeted, particularly those owned by minority families. "Look at this," Grace said, pointing to a map dotted with red markers. Every single one of these properties was hit with sudden violations after the luxury development plans were announced. But yours is different, it's the largest remaining original property in the area. David leaned forward, studying the familiar street names. His hands trembled slightly as he recognized several families who had already sold their homes under pressure. The Thompsons, who had lived 3 streets over, had moved out just last month after receiving massive fines they couldn't afford to fight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, David received an anonymous email containing internal HOA communications. The sender identified themselves only as a concerned board member who couldn't stay silent anymore. The emails revealed a calculated strategy to exploit outdated bylaws and create new ones specifically designed to target certain properties. They never expected anyone to fight back, Grace explained, reviewing the leaked documents. Most families either sell under pressure or bankrupt themselves trying to pay the fines. But your grandmother's foresight in keeping such detailed records of the properties. History gives us leverage they didn't anticipate. The next HOA meeting became the turning point. David and Grace arrived prepared, armed with evidence and determination. The community center was packed, the tension palpable as David stepped up to the microphone during the public comment section. "Before you try to silence me," he began, his voice steadied despite his racing heart, "I want everyone to see exactly what's been happening in our neighborhood." He projected the leaked emails onto the wall, revealing conversations between board members and developers that left no doubt about their true intentions. The room erupted in chaos. Longtime residents who had lost their homes stood up, sharing their own stories of harassment and discrimination. Mrs. Chen bravely testified about the conversations she had overheard, her voice growing stronger with each word as other neighbors nodded in support. But the HOA board's reaction proved even more damning than the evidence presented. The board president, Robert Wallace, attempted to shut down the meeting, his face red with anger. "This is all taken out of context," he sputtered, but his protests were drowned out by the community's collective voice. Local news stations picked up the story. Investigative reporters began digging deeper, uncovering connections between board members and the development company that had been buying up properties at suspiciously low prices. The story resonated with communities across the country facing similar battles. However, the HOA wasn't backing down easily. They hired a prestigious law firm known for defending corporations in discrimination cases. David started receiving anonymous threats, warning him to drop the case before things get worse. One morning, he woke up to find his grandmother's prized rose bushes destroyed, their roots torn from the earth. But the intimidation tactics had an unexpected effect, they brought the community closer together. Neighbors organized watch groups, taking turns monitoring David's property. Local landscapers volunteered to restore the garden, planting new roses alongside the surviving ones. Each act of destruction was met with an overwhelming wave of support and solidarity. Grace worked tirelessly, often late into the night, building their case. "They're getting desperate," she observed, noting the increasingly aggressive tactics. "But desperation makes people sloppy, and they're leaving a trail we can follow." The turning point came when a former HOA board member reached out to Grace, offering to testify. This insider's testimony would prove crucial, revealing how the board had specifically targeted properties based on the owners' racial backgrounds and the potential development value of their land. As Part 2 concludes, David stands in his garden, replanting vegetables in the same spots where his grandmother had taught him years ago. The legal battle ahead would be challenging, but he wasn't fighting alone anymore. The community had awakened to the injustice in their midst, and their collective voice was growing stronger. Looking at the newly planted garden, David remembered his grandmother's words, "Sometimes you have to weather the storm to see the rainbow." The storm was far from over, but for the first time since receiving that first violation notice, he could see hope on the horizon. As the legal battle intensified, Grace's small office became a hub of activity. People from neighboring communities began coming forward with similar stories, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. The pattern was undeniable: systematic targeting of minority homeowners, especially those with historically significant properties. One rainy afternoon, an elderly gentleman named Roy walked into Grace's office, leaning heavily on his cane. His hands shook as he placed a weathered manila envelope on her desk. Inside were photographs and documents dating back to the 1960s, showing how the area had transformed from a diverse community into what the developers now called an exclusive enclave. "My brother lost his home last year," Roy explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "He fought as long as he could, but the fines kept piling up. The stress took his health before they took his house." The documents he brought revealed a disturbing truth: the current HOA's tactics weren't new, they were using an updated version of historical discrimination practices. David spent his evenings after school helping Grace organize the growing mountain of evidence. They created a timeline showing how the HOA's leadership had changed shortly after the luxury development plans were announced. Each new board member had connections to either the development company or the real estate firms handling the property sales. The case took an unexpected turn when a young intern at the county records office discovered something crucial. The original HOA charter had never been properly updated to include the historic properties in its jurisdiction. This meant that all the fines and violations issued to David and others might have been illegal from the start. "They knew," Grace said, pacing her office. "They had to have known these properties were exempt. That's why they've been so aggressive about forcing quick sales. They needed to act before someone caught on." The community's support continued to grow. Local university students organized peaceful protests outside HOA meetings. Small business owners in the area started displaying "Stand with David" signs in their windows. Even some residents of the new luxury developments, horrified by the revelations, began speaking out against the board's actions. But the HOA's desperate attempts to maintain control reached new heights. Board members began spreading rumors about David's character, suggesting he was playing the race card for financial gain. Anonymous posts appeared on local forums questioning his ability to maintain such a large property on a teacher's salary. The pressure took its toll. David started having anxiety attacks, the weight of representing not just his family's legacy but an entire community's fight for justice becoming almost overwhelming. His garden, usually his sanctuary, reminded him of everything he stood to lose. One evening, while grading papers at his kitchen table, David heard a knock at his door. It was Mrs. Chen's grandson, a law student at the state university. He had been researching similar cases across the country and found something interesting: a precedent-setting case from another state where an HOA had been found guilty of discriminatory practices. "The similarities are striking," he explained, spreading out his research. That case led to a federal investigation. The HOA board members weren't just forced to resign, some of them faced criminal charges. Grace immediately saw the potential. If they could prove the same pattern of behavior, their case could do more than just save David's property, it could set a precedent for communities facing similar battles nationwide. The evidence kept mounting. A former employee of the development company came forward with emails showing how they had specifically identified target properties based on demographic data. Financial records revealed suspicious payments between HOA board members and shell companies linked to the developers. As word spread about the case, national civil rights organizations began offering support. Legal experts volunteered their time, helping Grace build an even stronger case. The local media coverage attracted the attention of larger news outlets, and suddenly the small community's fight was making headlines across the country. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a community meeting organized by David's supporters. One by one, families shared their stories of resistance and loss. Children spoke about watching their parents struggle against seemingly impossible odds. Elderly residents recalled the neighborhood's history of overcoming discrimination. As Part 3 draws to a close, David stands at his classroom whiteboard, teaching his students about momentum and resistance in physics. The parallel to his own situation isn't lost on him. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The harder the HOA pushed, the stronger the community's resistance grew. The case took a dramatic turn when Grace received an unexpected call from the state attorney general's office. The mounting evidence and media attention had caught their interest, particularly the pattern of discriminatory practices affecting multiple communities. They were launching their own investigation into the HOA's activities. Meanwhile, life in Pine Grove grew increasingly tense. David noticed more luxury cars driving slowly past his property, their occupants taking photos and making notes. The development company had accelerated construction on nearby plots. Heavy machinery working from dawn till dusk, creating a constant backdrop of noise and dust. One morning, David arrived at school to find his students unusually quiet. One of them finally spoke up, showing him a social media post. Someone had created a fake profile using his name and photo, making it appear he was posting inflammatory comments about the neighborhood and its residents. The HOA board quickly seized on these posts, using them to paint David as the aggressor in their narrative. "They're trying to destroy your reputation," Grace warned during an emergency meeting. "But we can use this. It shows how desperate they've become." She had already traced the fake accounts to an IP address connected to a board member's business. The Attorney General's investigation unveiled a complex web of financial transactions. The development company had been using shell corporations to hide their connections to the HOA board members. Property assessments had been deliberately manipulated to devalue targeted homes while inflating the potential value of developed lots. Support came from an unexpected quarter when several residents of the new luxury developments reached out to David. They had bought their homes believing they were part of an up-and-coming community, not realizing they were participating in the displacement of longtime residents. Many were horrified by the revelations and offered to testify about the misleading sales tactics used by the developers. "We were told this was all vacant land being repurposed," one new resident admitted during a deposition. "They never mentioned forcing out existing homeowners. We wouldn't have bought if we'd known." The pressure began affecting the HOA board's unity. During a particularly heated board meeting, tensions erupted when the treasurer, visibly distressed, stood up and resigned on the spot. "I can't be part of this anymore," he announced, his voice shaking. "What we're doing, it's not just wrong, it's criminal." David's students organized a peaceful demonstration outside the school board meeting, defending their teacher's character. Their signs told stories of how he had inspired them, helped them, believed in them. The local media coverage of these young people standing up for their teacher helped shift public opinion even further in David's favor. Grace's office had become a command center for the growing legal battle. Maps covered the walls, showing properties that had been targeted, sold, and developed. Red strings connected documents, revealing patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. The evidence was overwhelming, but the opposition's resources seemed unlimited. The development company made one last attempt to end the fight. Their lawyer approached Grace with a settlement offer, twice the property's market value if David would sell and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The amount was staggering, enough to buy a much larger property in a different area and still have money left over. David spent a sleepless night considering the offer. Standing in his grandmother's garden at dawn, he watched the sun rise over the trees she had planted decades ago. The property wasn't just land and buildings, it was generations of memories, of struggle, of triumph. How could he put a price on that? His decision became clear when he found a box of his grandmother's old papers in the attic. Among them was a letter she had written but never sent, describing her dreams for the property's future. "This land is our anchor," she had written. It reminds us that we belong here, that we have the right to build our lives where we choose. The Attorney General's office scheduled a press conference to announce their findings. The night before, David received a text message from an unknown number: "Last chance to take the deal. Tomorrow will be too late." He forwarded the message to Grace and deleted it, his resolve stronger than ever. The morning of the Attorney General's press conference dawned with an unusual stillness over Pine Grove. Local news vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. David stood in his kitchen, watching through the window as neighbors gathered in small groups, their faces tense with anticipation. Grace arrived early, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Whatever happens today," she said, setting her coffee on the counter, "remember that you've already changed things. People aren't afraid to speak up anymore." The press conference was held at the county courthouse, its marble steps crowded with reporters and community members. The Attorney General, a composed woman with silver-streaked hair, stepped up to the podium. Her words cut through the morning air with devastating clarity. The investigation had uncovered extensive evidence of discriminatory practices, price manipulation, and illegal cooperation between the HOA board and developers. Bank records revealed kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Board members had used insider information to profit from property sales they had forced through their actions. "This isn't just about property rights," the Attorney General declared. "This is about the systematic attempt to erase a community's history and displace its residents for profit. We are filing charges against 7 current and former HOA board members, as well as executives from the development company." The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and shocked murmurs. David felt Mrs. Chen's hand grip his arm as she wiped tears from her eyes. Nearby, Roy nodded silently, thinking of his brother who hadn't lived to see this day. But the announcement was just the beginning. The investigation had also revealed similar patterns in other communities across the state. The Attorney General's office was launching a broader inquiry, using Pine Grove's case as a template to identify and prosecute similar schemes. The aftermath was immediate. The development company's stock price plummeted. Construction sites fell silent as permits were suspended pending review. HOA board members began turning on each other, each trying to minimize their own involvement. David's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and media requests for interviews. But amid the celebration, he noticed something concerning: subtle signs of division in the community. Some residents, particularly those who had recently bought homes in the new developments, worried about their property values. Others feared the negative attention would affect the entire neighborhood's reputation. Grace recognized the potential for these divisions to undermine their progress. She organized a community meeting at the local library, bringing together residents from both old and new developments. "This isn't about us versus them," she explained. "It's about creating a community where everyone's rights are protected." The meeting became a turning point. New residents shared their own feelings of being misled by the developers. Longtime residents spoke about their deep connections to the neighborhood. Together, they began discussing ways to move forward, to build something stronger from the ashes of conflict. One evening, as David walked through his garden, he found a group of neighborhood children playing near his vegetable beds. They had created a small sign reading, "Community Garden," and were eagerly asking if they could help plant something. Their parents stood nearby, looking somewhat uncertain but hopeful. This sparked an idea. David remembered how his grandmother had always shared her garden's bounty with neighbors. Working with other residents, he developed a proposal to create a community garden program, using part of his land to teach local children about growing food and the area's agricultural history. The initiative quickly gained support. Families from both old and new developments volunteered to help. Local businesses donated supplies. Even some former HOA board members who hadn't been involved in the corruption reached out, wanting to be part of the healing process. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings continued. Each new revelation seemed to uncover more layers of deception. The development company's internal emails revealed how they had specifically targeted properties with historical significance, seeing them as obstacles to their plans for luxury condominiums. Grace worked tirelessly to ensure that the momentum wasn't lost. She helped establish a legal aid fund for other communities facing similar battles. David's case had become a blueprint for fighting discriminatory housing practices, and requests for assistance poured in from across the country. The transition from conflict to healing wasn't smooth. As the criminal proceedings against the HOA board members continued, Pine Grove found itself navigating unfamiliar territory. The initial euphoria of victory had faded, replaced by the complex reality of rebuilding a divided community. David's community garden initiative became an unexpected catalyst for change. One Saturday morning, he arrived to find an elderly resident from the new development standing uncertainly by the garden gate. She introduced herself as Eleanor, explaining that she'd been a master gardener before moving to Pine Grove. "I've been watching what you're doing here," she said, gesturing to the flourishing vegetable beds. "Maybe you could use some help." Her expertise proved invaluable, and soon she was leading workshops for neighborhood children, teaching them about companion planting and natural pest control. The legal aftermath continued to unfold. As the prosecution built its case, more details emerged about how deep the corruption had run. The development company's internal documents revealed a nationwide strategy of targeting historically significant properties in minority communities, using HOAs as tools for displacement. Grace found herself working longer hours than ever, coordinating with prosecutors and helping other communities build similar cases. "What happened here in Pine Grove," she explained during a community meeting, "it's like pulling a thread that's unraveling a much bigger tapestry of discrimination." The media attention brought both benefits and challenges. While it helped spread awareness of housing discrimination issues, it also attracted opportunists. Real estate speculators began circling the neighborhood, hoping to capitalize on the uncertainty. Some residents received unsolicited offers for their properties, often accompanied by veiled warnings about future property values. David faced personal challenges too. Despite the Attorney General's findings, some still viewed him as a troublemaker who had damaged the neighborhood's reputation. Anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox, blaming him for declining property values and the stalled development projects. But for every act of resistance, there were more signs of positive change. The local historical society, inspired by the case, began documenting the neighborhood's rich history. They collected stories from longtime residents, photographed historic homes, and created an exhibition at the local library. One particularly moving moment came when a group of high school students, including several from David's science classes, created a documentary about Pine Grove. They interviewed residents both old and new, capturing the community's journey from division to reconciliation. The film premiered at a community center event that brought together people from all parts of the neighborhood. The criminal trials began in early fall. Each day, David sat in the courtroom, watching as the carefully constructed scheme was exposed piece by piece. Former board members testified against each other, revealing how they had manipulated rules and targeted specific homeowners. The development company's executives tried to distance themselves, but the paper trail told a different story. During this time, the community garden flourished. What had started as a small gesture of reconciliation had grown into a true community hub. Families gathered there on weekends, sharing gardening tips and harvest bounty. Children who had once been separated by invisible boundaries now played together among the tomato vines. Eleanor, the master gardener, organized a harvest festival, bringing together residents from all parts of Pine Grove. People brought dishes made with vegetables from the community garden, sharing recipes and stories. The event became a symbol of how far they'd come, and how much further they could go. The legal proceedings also sparked changes at the state level. Lawmakers began drafting legislation to provide better oversight of HOAs and protect historically significant properties. David was invited to testify before the state legislature, sharing his experience in advocating for stronger protections against housing discrimination. One evening, as David walked home from a particularly long day at the trials, he noticed something different. The hostile stares had been replaced by friendly waves. Gardens were blooming in front yards where there had only been lawn. Children played freely across property lines that had once seemed like barriers. Grace stopped by to share updates on the case, but their conversations increasingly turned to the future. "The legal victory is important," she said, watching neighborhood kids tending their garden plots, "but what's happening here, this is the real change." As winter approached, the criminal trials reached their final phase. The courthouse steps, once crowded with protesters and reporters, now hosted quiet conversations between neighbors discussing the future of their community. The development company's CEO and 5 former HOA board members had pleaded guilty to various charges, but the community's work was far from over. David found himself busier than ever, balancing his teaching duties with community organizing. The garden had become a symbol of rebirth, even as frost touched the late-season vegetables. Families had begun planning for spring planting, sharing catalogs and discussing which heritage seeds to preserve. One cold morning, David received an unexpected visitor. It was one of the former HOA board members who hadn't been involved in the corruption. She came with a proposal from a group of residents. They wanted to create a new community organization, one that would protect both property rights and community heritage. "We need to learn from what happened," she explained, her breath visible in the cold air. "The old system was designed to divide us. We want to build something different." The proposal included plans for preserving historic properties while supporting responsible development that would benefit the entire community. Grace had been receiving calls from civil rights organizations across the country. Pine Grove's story had become a blueprint for other communities fighting similar battles. She organized workshops, teaching residents how to recognize warning signs of discriminatory practices and how to document evidence of systematic targeting. The state legislature was finalizing new regulations for HOAs, incorporating many lessons from Pine Grove. David had been asked to serve on an advisory committee, ensuring that the new rules would protect vulnerable communities. The legislation, dubbed the Community Heritage Protection Act, would require HOAs to undergo regular audits and maintain transparent relationships with development companies. In the classroom, David noticed changes in his students' engagement with civic issues. They asked deeper questions about community organizing and civil rights. Several had started a club focused on local history and preservation, interviewing elderly residents and documenting their stories. The community garden took on new significance as winter approached. Eleanor suggested creating a greenhouse using recycled materials, allowing them to continue growing food year-round. The project brought together residents with different skills. Contractors worked alongside teachers, retirees alongside students. One Saturday, while working on the greenhouse, David overheard 2 neighbors, one from the old community, one from the new development, discovering they had grown up in the same small town. Such connections were becoming more common as artificial barriers between old and new residents continued to break down. The legal aftermath had unexpected ripple effects. Other development companies began reaching out to Grace, asking for guidance on creating truly inclusive communities. Some were motivated by genuine desire for change, others by fear of similar legal consequences, but the result was a growing conversation about responsible development. David's grandmother's property, once targeted for destruction, was now being considered for historic preservation status. The application highlighted not just the property's age, but its role in the community's civil rights struggle. The garden had become a living museum of local agricultural history. The winter brought challenges. Some residents worried that property values would never recover from the scandal. Others feared that new development would stop completely, leaving the community frozen in time. These concerns led to heated discussions at community meetings, but now the conversations were different, focused on finding solutions rather than casting blame. Grace helped establish a community legal aid center in the old HOA office building. The center provided free legal advice to residents facing housing discrimination and helped other communities build cases against predatory development practices. The irony of its location wasn't lost on anyone. One evening, while grading papers at his kitchen table, David found an old photo of his grandmother standing proudly in her garden. He remembered her words about weathering storms and realized that she had been preparing him for this moment all along. The property wasn't just land, it was a testament to resilience and the power of community. The media attention had mostly faded, but the real work of building a stronger community continued. Residents organized regular town halls to discuss development plans, ensuring that growth would benefit everyone. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest and inclusive. As spring returned to Pine Grove, the final chapter of this transformative journey began to unfold. The one-year anniversary of the Attorney General's announcement approached, and the community decided to mark it not as a celebration of victory, but as a commitment to continued growth and healing. David's classroom had become a living laboratory of civic engagement. His students had created a comprehensive archive of the community's struggle, documenting everything from court transcripts to personal stories. One morning, a student raised her hand with a question that struck him deeply: how do we make sure this never happens again? The question led to the creation of the Pine Grove Heritage Project. Residents began collecting oral histories, photographs, and documents that told the story of their community's evolution. The project wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about creating a roadmap for other communities facing similar challenges. Grace's Legal Aid Center had grown into a regional resource. She hired 2 young attorneys who had followed the Pine Grove case during law school. Together, they developed guidelines for identifying predatory development practices and helping communities protect their historical properties. The new community organization, now officially established, took a different approach from the old HOA. Instead of focusing on restrictions and violations, they emphasized preservation, sustainability, and inclusive development. Monthly meetings became forums for creative problem-solving rather than confrontation. The greenhouse project had exceeded everyone's expectations. During the coldest months, it had provided fresh vegetables for community members in need. Local schools began bringing students for field trips, teaching them about sustainable agriculture and community cooperation. The garden had become a living classroom. Eleanor, the master gardener, worked with David to develop a seed library, preserving heirloom varieties that had been grown in the area for generations. She also started a mentoring program, pairing experienced gardeners with newcomers who wanted to learn. The garden beds became a tapestry of different growing styles and cultural traditions. The state legislature passed the Community Heritage Protection Act, with Pine Grove's story serving as its foundation. David attended the signing ceremony, thinking about how his grandmother would have felt seeing their family struggle contribute to lasting change. The new law provided tools for communities to protect their heritage while managing responsible growth. One warm Saturday, David found himself surrounded by 3 generations of residents as they prepared the garden for spring planting. Children eagerly dug in the soil alongside their grandparents, learning the rhythm of seasons and the importance of roots, both literal and metaphorical. The development company's abandoned construction sites were being transformed. Through community input sessions, residents designed mixed-use spaces that would preserve historic properties while adding needed amenities. The plans included affordable housing units, ensuring that future development would strengthen rather than divide the community. Grace organized a conference bringing together community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates from across the country. Pine Grove residents shared their experiences, but more importantly, they listened to others' stories, recognizing that their struggle was part of a larger movement for housing justice. The local high school added a new curriculum component about community organizing and civil rights, using Pine Grove's story as a case study. David's students interviewed residents, created documentaries, and developed projects exploring how communities can resist discrimination while building bridges of understanding. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of hope, David sat on his grandmother's porch with Mrs. Chen and Eleanor. They watched young families stroll past, children playing across yards that no longer recognized artificial boundaries. The conversation turned to the future, to what Pine Grove might become in another generation. "We didn't just save properties," Mrs. Chen observed, "we saved the idea of community itself." Eleanor nodded, adding, "And we showed that it's never too late to rebuild trust." The Pine Grove Heritage Center opened in what had once been the HOA's offices. Its first exhibition featured the timeline of the community's struggle, but more importantly, it showcased plans for the future, designs for sustainable development, programs for youth engagement, and initiatives to preserve local history. As the final chapter drew to a close, David stood in his garden, now a symbol of resilience and renewal. The property that developers had once seen as an obstacle had become a bridge between past and future, a living reminder that community bonds are stronger than any force trying to break them. The story of Pine Grove wasn't just about fighting injustice, it was about reimagining what a community could be. The lessons learned would ripple outward, touching other neighborhoods, inspiring other struggles for justice, and reminding future generations that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The legacy of Pine Grove would live on in the children who played in the community garden, in the new laws protecting vulnerable communities, and in the countless stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when they stood together for what was right. As David watched the sun set on another day in Pine Grove, he knew that while this chapter was ending, the real story, the story of a community that found its voice and its heart, would continue to inspire long after the headlines faded away.